Hi, it's John. Welcome back to FinTech Plus. I am honored to be joined today by Robin Hanson. He's a distinguished professor of economics at George Masson University. Thanks for joining us, Robin. How are you doing?
Good to be here.
I was hoping that before we get into things, we can have you give a quick introduction to your career because it really has been an interesting one, and it's a wide body of work that you delve into. How would you introduce yourself and what it is that you focus on? Because I know you started in philosophy and physics and sociology, but maybe you can give us some highlights from there.
Well, I'm sure from other people's point of view, I look different and you can describe me in many ways. But from my point of view, my world is about looking for important neglected ideas and trying to develop and pursue them. So I have always asked, what was the most interesting topics in this area? And then I've often switched areas when I found that what seemed to be important didn't seem to be as quite important, or I came to understand it. And then I kept jumping from area to area when I realized that something else was even more important and had even more neglected potential. And eventually I became an economics professor, in part because you can just do a lot of things and call it economics. And I have done a wide range of things and call it economics. So I've worked in prediction markets and information aggregation. I've worked in the great filter and the long-term future of humanity. I've worked on thinking about what happens when robots rule the earth, and just a wide range of what I thought were important and neglected topics. So, that's where you get my attention if we just talk about one of these top important neglected topics and get into it and talk about what the potential there is.
I think we're going to have the opportunity to touch on a number of those subjects as we get along. Something that I wanted to note that I think is interesting about your career as we get started here to draw some connections is that you not only work in academia, but you do really get your hands dirty. And this is at the leading edge of topics that you discuss in your work on futurism, but it comes together in advanced research. And I was hoping you could share a few insights from that.
Well, one of my pet areas is prediction markets, that is using betting markets to forecast events and advise decisions. And in that area, I've seen that academia does the sorts of things that academia can get credit for, where they can get publications out of it. And they built up a pile of mechanisms and studies and tools and things like that. But then the actual potential to be realized needs lots of concrete trials and real organizations. And that's the sort of thing academics don't do because they can't get much credit for it. And so I've tried as much as possible to push and to help and advise organizations to do many small concrete trials, but it's hard because often organizations mainly want to be associated with an academic, mainly just for the prestige of being able to say that they have this academic they're working with on some important project. And so for those sorts of purposes, they mainly want something that's just low risk and won't bother anybody. And unfortunately, to use betting markets or prediction markets inside of organizations, you tend to need to tackle and address important questions that are somewhat politically sensitive in the organizations, and that creates a big obstacle. And so that's helped me learn about how real organizations work and what are the big obstacles to innovation when you're trying to do something that matters and will bother people.
The idea of mixing things, whether it be tradition and innovation or corporates and startups in the open innovation world, is really at the center of what we do. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more directly from your experience in advanced research. How do you really make innovation work when it comes to mixing together things?
Well, the basic fact of innovation is that it's something we all praise and we all say is a good idea, but that we don't, when it comes down to it, really like. That is, most of us are in relatively stable organizational contexts, and innovation is basically doing something different that's hard to predict and probably won't go well. That is, most innovation doesn't work out, and it's only a small percentage of innovation that ends up having been worth the bother. But of course, that small percentage is what pays for all the rest. So, many places are willing to try to be associated with innovation in the hope that they can claim the visionary credit of having been an innovator. So they're less interested in actually trying new things out than in just being able to say that they tried new things out, and especially that they were associated with prestigious visionaries or academics or who are supporting the innovation. And so the actual innovation is generally painful, and generally people would like to be associated with the credit for having invented an idea. And so there's this standard not invented here syndrome, which is People are mainly interested in trying out ideas that somebody nearby can claim to be the inventor of, so they can game association. And so that greatly neglects simple diffusion. So most innovation is actually diffusion, where it comes from someone else and you copy it and you adapt it to your circumstances. But people are far less interested in diffusion because they can't get credit for being the great inventor or the friend of the great inventor.
I was wondering, do you think that the evolution of technology is making innovation easier or harder? We've heard that the idea that things are accelerating is going faster and faster, and we're getting closer to this concept of the singularity. But also, before we started recording, we talked about how FinTech is still facing challenges reaching commercial success. What are your thoughts in terms of whether it's easier or harder?
One of the great questions about innovation that we've always asked is, does innovation accelerate or decelerate, or what are the factors that push one way or the other? So one obvious factor that pushes for acceleration is that the more we learn, the more we can use to learn more. That is, all the things we learn, all the tools we have enable research and trials and innovation efforts all the more. On the other hand, we have the low-hanging fruit thing, which is we try the best looking ideas first, and then later on what we have are the leftover ideas that we didn't try the first time. And those seem to roughly balance over history, except at sort of big bursts like the Industrial Revolution and the Farming Revolution. But I think another factor that's unfortunately been weighing down is just increasing regulation and comfort. So a lot of innovation is driven by people who are desperate enough to be willing to try substantial changes. They aren't comfortable where they are, and they need to do something. So the more rich and comfortable we all get, and the more secure we get, the less eager we are to try new things. I mean, we'd like to try a thing that was only an upside, but there's almost always a downside as well, if just wasted time and effort and embarrassment. So most organizations, over long times of peace and prosperity, organizations and people have just been getting comfortable and just less willing to tolerate big changes. And that means big innovation is really getting cut back. Now, you can separate innovation into sort of big changes that are really noticeable and require a long time to see, and lots of little small innovation where you don't have to take as big a risk. And small innovation is where most of the total innovation is, but it can't happen unless you also sometimes have the more rare big innovations. And I fear that we're just not allowing as many big innovations as we used to. And so we're concentrating our innovation efforts into the few areas where innovation is allowed. And that's, in some sense, one of the main attractive features that FinTech has always advertised the world, is that, hey, here you can do innovation because you can get away with it because, hey, the regulators can't really get here. They'll have trouble regulating this, and therefore that's been one of the stories people have given about FinTech. And of course, it's not entirely obvious that that's true in the sense that most of the organizations and people who are doing the actual innovation are not hiding themselves from government and wearing blackface and hiding their voice on things like this. They're showing up at conferences. They have public companies which have addresses and things like that. So it's not actually clear that FinTech really can evade regulation more easily than other technologies. Although regulators have backed off for a little while and given them space, the regulators, when they feel like it, looks like they can come in and stomp all over whatever they want to.
I want to come back to the topic of central bank digital currencies and Bitcoin, because that's a hot one in the markets right now. But before we move on, I do want to talk quickly about the sources of innovation and the incentives that tend to naturally emerge to help cause them. We talked about real pain points in the situations where, for example, maybe a loved one has cancer, or you're an immigrant motivated to find a place in a local community and economy. Oftentimes, those at the bottom of the pyramid are a long way from where we are here in Switzerland and the USA and dealing with financial services and innovation. But that's where real stuff comes from, and why we're quite interested in topics like financial inclusion. There's something I think is somewhat related, and I wanted to ask for your opinion on it. The idea of paying it forward as the innovator versus being an early adopter. The sense that if you do pay it forward, you create value that you will have returned is somewhat at odds with acquiring things quickly once they've been proven. Do you see that as being something that's important, that is crucial to get the natural flow of forces in an ecosystem working effectively, or what do you think?
I guess I would more see sometimes there's a culture of innovation. There's a community of people who see themselves as innovators, And then they celebrate people within that community that they see as innovators. And then many people are eager to be seen as innovators, and they're often willing to pay substantial costs, and they're willing to lose on average on the projects they try if that will buy them this aura of the innovator. And that's, in a sense, a way in which communities can subsidize and promote innovation, is by having this way they celebrate innovators. Now, unfortunately, usually the celebration of the innovators is a celebration of inventors, not of diffusers, but in general, invention is more diffusion than invention. Innovation is more diffusion than invention. And so cultures that celebrate invention often neglect diffusion. And so they, in fact, get a vast oversupply of invention, but not enough sharing and trying and spreading of innovations.
Speaking of diffusion, I wanted to take the opportunity to come back and look at your work, because you've really been exceptional at looking out in the fringes and picking out ideas that are really outliers that deserve more attention. And I was thinking about your fiction and publications in particular. I found one work, The Age of Elm, particularly interesting, and I was hoping you could say a few words about the book.
I've always liked science fiction, as do many people. But when I was young, I could enjoy it more because I didn't know as much about how technology or just the world worked. And the more I learned over the years, the more I realized that most science fiction doesn't make sense, because the social world it presents and the way the economics works and even the technology works just doesn't fit what could actually happen. But of course, when you're young and naive, you don't notice that. And so I always wanted to have a worked out description of what would actually happen in a common science fiction scenario, using our best understanding of how the world works and technology works. And so eventually this frustration had built enough in me that I decided to take the brain emulation scenario. So this is a very common science fiction and futurist scenario. It's a very dramatic scenario where you can take individual human brains, scan them, and find spatial and chemical detail, and then see exactly which cells are where, connected to what, of what type. And then you can make a computer model of that brain that works the same way in terms of has the same input-output connections and relationships. And so if you can make a computer model of an individual brain that you have scanned, then that computer model can substitute for the original brain, artificial eyes, ears, and hands and mouth. And that's what we call a brain emulation, or I call it M short. And so my book is The Age of M, the age of these brain emulations. And so the assumption is brain emulations become cheap enough that they can substitute wholesale for people. That is, they are faster, more reliable, cheaper than humans. And so basically they take pretty much all the jobs. And then what happens next? And the world is full of science fiction novels, again, where they have a few of these characters or items in the story, far fewer stories where they try to describe an entire world of these things. But none of those really go very far in being realistic and saying what would actually happen. And so I decided to take my decades of experience in related areas and put together an analysis of what that world would actually look like. And it's weird, but that's what you should expect most any future world to look like if it's based on a radically different technology. That is, our world is really quite different from the world of 1,000 or 10,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago. And people from back then, if they had seen a description of our life and our world, they would have been, in part horrified, in part amazed and envious. But it would just mostly to them be weird. They would just have a hard time getting their hand around it. And that's basically what happens with The Age of M. My book goes in great detail, page after page, telling you many detailed things about what this world would be like and what happens there. And mostly you just have to try to get a sense for how this weird world is. And when you finally understand it, you will love some things and hate other things and find it hard to judge whether you think it's good overall, which is exactly what you should expect for a typical future. It's just going to be weird. And that's what I'm proud to have produced for you. A detailed image of a strange future that you find it hard to judge.
That's rather poetic. Congratulations on quite a well-received take on the future and a really thought-provoking one. What attracted me to the book, of course, was the look at consciousness and brain emulation, but of course also the way that topics of everyday life like love and work evolve. I wanted to ask you, did that have anything to do with what you looked at in the next book, The Elephant in the Brain?
The Elephant in the Brain is a book co-authored with the wonderful co-author Kevin Simler about what I think are the biggest mistakes we social scientists and policymakers make in trying to analyze the social world. So I've been an economics professor for several decades now, and I've seen over the years a lot of areas where we social scientists and policy people, come to an area and we notice some patterns and we try to fit those patterns into our usual theory of what's going on, and they just don't fit that well. And so they just remain these awkward puzzles. And I've come to realize that most of these puzzles that I've come across in my lifetime can be reasonably well explained if you just go back to the basics and say, what if this thing isn't about what people have been saying about? So, for example, people talk about school as if the point of school is to learn the material so that you can be a more productive or interesting person later in life. But what if school isn't about learning the material? What if it's about just showing off how smart and conscientious you are? What if charity isn't about helping people, but charity is about showing off how good you feel and that you have sympathetic feelings for people who are in pain? What if conversation isn't about sharing information, but it's more about showing off that you have a lot of mental tools and resources that would be useful to other people? So if you just go back to the basics and say, we've been assuming that this whole area is about X, and what if it's not about X? What if it's more about Y? How does that help us understand many of these puzzles? And it turns out a lot of the major puzzles that we social scientists have struggled with for decades can be more elegantly resolved by assuming that we have just been wrong about why we do things.
Yeah, it's interesting. For me, it's a bit like how the idea, if we open our minds and we realize that things can be a bit ambiguous, we see that they have a bit of a bad and a both side inherent and entangled in them. And if we are willing to flip that cup, we can better appreciate the full picture. Is that how you would describe things?
So the key idea here is that we each present ourselves to the world in a favorable light, and we're not being entirely honest with ourselves. So we tend to think of ourselves as the brain, that we're the CEO and we run things, and we don't notice all the details all the time, but any one detail we wanted to notice, we could if we only asked about it. And the truth is that we're more like the press secretary of our brain. The conscious mind that I'm talking to right now that might talk back to me, that's not the king or president of your brain. It's not running things and making all the decisions. What it does is try to justify them. It's like I say in the book, it's like the somewhat slimy guy who stands next to the king who says, "Very judicious choice, sir." Or the press secretary for the president, right? Who doesn't really know why the president does things or even what necessarily they've done. But if asked a question, they try to find the best looking spin on what they've done to explain it best. And so the key idea is that humans evolved long ago to have norms that we enforced on each other, rules about what you're supposed to do and not supposed to do. And these were so important that we created this conscious brain system, which was in charge of constantly looking at what we're doing and asking, how could I explain what I'm doing here in the best possible light so that I couldn't be accused of norm violations? And a lot of the norms we have are in terms of motives. That is, if I hit you on purpose, that's pretty bad. If I hit you accidentally, that could be excused. And so motives are very central to our story of why we're good people and why we aren't violating norms. And so that's why we're constantly trying to come up with these stories of what our motives are. And they're not actually the motives we have. That they're not actually the motives that best explain our behavior. They're the motives we can spin and kind of, convince people to accept that will make us most protected from accusations of breaking rules.
I find that really interesting, and how these topics connect. We talked a few weeks ago with Keith Campbell, who's the author of The New Science of Narcissism, and we talked a lot about President Trump being an example of a successful but toxic narcissist. And he had a press secretary who was quite famous in the financial world, Anthony Scaramucci from the hedge fund to fund space. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that kind of connection, because there's an example in GameStop that really looks at how fringe voices can challenge the established ones. And I was wondering how that fits into your work and what you would say on the subject.
So my main relationship to thinking about markets is to think about them as mechanisms in general that we use for some purposes and that we could potentially use for other purposes if we so choose. And so in general, a major social problem we always have is how to decide what to believe, and especially how to decide what to believe together. That is, what sort of consensus can we construct that many of us can accept as the consensus when we are not experts or specialists in an area. And in society, we have many different institutions that try to create such a consensus. We have academic journals, and we have elite commissions, and we have journalists creating, articles and perceptions there. But financial markets, especially speculative markets, are another robust and ancient mechanism we've had to produce a consensus that we can accept and use. And I still think that relative to our other consensus mechanisms, the financial market consensus is the most robust and resistant to foul play of various sorts. That is, people, if they want to, they can and have manipulated, academic journals or mass media articles and perceptions that people teach in school, and all of these sorts of consensus are all things in which people have distorted for their various purposes. And financial markets can, of course, also in some sense be distorted, but they are just more robust and resistant to that sort of manipulation. So that's not to say that every financial market estimate is always the best estimate of the truth. Is saying, can you point me to some other estimate I could rely on instead that would be consistently more accurate and consistently more robust to these sorts of manipulation? And I just don't think you can. So I think that for somebody who's not a specialist in a topic area, if there's a financial market price on that question that, especially a betting market price that you could just look at, you should just basically accept that as your best estimate, unless you are enough of an expert such that you could form an independent judgment and you trust that enough. But if you are that much of an expert, in addition to relying on your separate judgment, you should also probably go bet in the financial markets and correct them and be paid to correct them by fixing the financial market errors. And so that's the institution I've recommended in many contexts, which is to say, let's rely less on official academic commissions and journals and journalists and agency heads having rulings, and let's rely more on financial market prices as our collective consensus, where we each both rely on it when we don't know better. And if we do know better, we fix it and get paid to fix it. And that's something we could use in far more context than we do. So a lot of my attempt is try to really just show people we could use this, say, to tell you which presidential candidate would be better for the country. We could use it to tell you whether a particular bill that Congress might pass would be better for the country. But, on smaller scales, we could use it to decide whether you should dump a CEO from a company or keep him, whether the company should start a new project, whether you should expand into a new area. Lots of concrete decisions organizations make. We could use financial market prices to advise those decisions and arguably get more accurate and more robust manipulation-resistant estimates.
We've mentioned governance a few times, and you've just raised consensus, and I do want to talk about crypto and blockchain in a moment. But before I do that, can you quickly explain the topic of futarchy and how that might relate to all of this?
Decision markets, also known as futarchy when they're sort of ambitiously framed, are just the idea that we can have speculative betting prices that directly advise decisions. Now, in some sense, all market prices could be indirectly advising decisions, but to directly advise a decision, what you want to do is have an estimate of, if we do this, what's the outcome? So, for example, a favorite example of mine of decision markets would be a public company stock price conditional on whether we keep the CEO or whether we dump the CEO. So those are two different prices, and those two prices can be produced by speculative markets if you set them up right. And the difference between those two prices would be a direct market advice about whether to keep the CEO. And the basic structure there is you have this outcome, the stock market of the company, and you have a decision, keep the CEO or not keep the CEO. And if you have those two elements, then you can set up markets that estimate the outcome given the decision. And speculative markets can give accurate and, again, manipulation-resistant estimates to those sorts of questions and advise not just whether you should keep the CEO, but whether you should keep the CFO, and whether you should expand into new territory, or whether you should, merge with another company, et cetera, all the way down the line. There's a huge potential for using decision markets to advise key decisions, especially when there are many people who might know things that you're not sure who it is that knows, and they know that they know, and where there are people who want to influence and manipulate decision, not necessarily to your favor.
Anecdotally, it reminds me of a story from a friend who had been to Germany and was at a bar where they had a stock market mechanism to help sort out the prices of the beer, and it had some interesting results. And it got me thinking about, when it comes to consensus and governance, what your thoughts are around the concept of the wisdom of the crowd.
I don't think markets are about the wisdom of crowds. Markets are a mechanism to produce the wisdom of whoever participates. And the whole point is that markets will induce incentives for people to self-select and participate if they actually think they know better than others. Now, markets are an open institution in that we don't have some committee that initially selects who's allowed to participate. We initially say anybody can participate, but we create strong incentives for people to self-select. So most people today do not trade in most financial markets. If most people hardly even know that orange juice futures exist, and most people are not tempted to trade in orange juice futures. So the people who trade in orange juice futures are the people who have self-selected to trade in there. Now, some of those people shouldn't be there. They don't know that yet, and they're going to learn that lesson over the coming months and years when they consistently lose and then learn to go away. But the net effect of these institutions is they are mostly dominated by people who have stayed around and not lost and gone away. And so they end up being relatively well informed. They tend to be dominated by the people who have enough resources and confidence in what they think to participate regularly and then not be contradicted by what they see in terms of the trades they make. And that's the nature of most financial markets, and that's who's participating. And they tended to be accurate. So we have many different studies that have had a lot of data that try to compare financial market prices to other sources of forecasts. And basically the financial market prices either consistently are about the same or substantially better. They are almost never substantially worse.
A lot of what you're describing sounds familiar in our work and what we do, working with natural selection and forces of the market to help enable innovation and successful investment. One of the topics that seems related in your work is the concept of the great filter. And I was wondering if you could just explain that in a bit more detail and contrast also to some of what we've already been saying.
Well, the great filter is a concept to help you understand a great question, which is the classic Fermi question, where is everybody? It doesn't have much to do necessarily with FinTech or even the elephant in the brain or the age of M or other sorts of things I worked on. It's just a separate topic, but there is this basic fundamental question that the universe looks empty and dead. And that's surprising because around here, we're not empty and dead. And we tend to think that we have a good chance over the next 1,000 million years to advance and then spread out into the universe in a big way where we would make a big visible impact on the universe. We would be expansionist and, make big changes. And if that were true, other people, when they look in the direction, they would see something that was different and they would notice us. And when we look out, we don't see things like that now. And so that means that somewhere between ordinary simple dead matter and this expanding visible civilization, there's a process that is very hard. That is, each particular asteroid, planet, wherever it is in the universe, it potentially has the chance to originate simple life, then more advanced life, et cetera, all the way down the line, and eventually produce not just something like us, but something more advanced than us that would, again, expand and change how things look. The fact that there's this vast universe and apparently almost nothing has done that we can see suggests that it's very rare for any one planet, et cetera, to go all the way through that path. And so the great filter is whatever are the obstacles along that path that eventually make it really hard. So the net sum of the great filter is huge. That is, if you see 10 to the 24 planets out there in the visible universe, then that means 1 in 10 to the 24 planets can only make it down that filter if we see that none of them have done that. And so this great filter is a large number, and it's presumably broken into small numbers, which is different filters at different stages along the path. It could all be concentrated at one spot, or it could be spread out across the whole path. But a key thing we want to know is how far along the filter are we now? Because we aren't all the way. We aren't at the point where we have spread into the universe and made a big visible change. And so that means part of the filter could still be ahead of us. And again, if the whole filter is, say, 10 to the 24, if just 1 in 24 fraction of the filter is ahead of us, that means we have only a 1 in 10 chance of making it to that larger stage. If 1/8 of the filter is ahead of us, then that means that we have only a 1 in 1,000 chance to make it to that farther stage. So the future of humanity in terms of its having at least the option to expand into the universe is heavily dependent on how far along the filter are we. And so one key thing to notice is that the more evidence we see of other things in the universe that have gotten at least partway along the filter that's behind us, that we've already passed, then that would tend to suggest that the filter behind us is less hard than we might have thought. And unfortunately, that will suggest that the filter ahead of us is harder than we might have thought, which is bad news. So it will be bad news to find life out in the universe, especially if it has an independent origin to us. So if we find, say, life on Mars, but we say life on Mars started there and then came to Earth, and so it had the same sort of origin, then that'll be less bad news. But if we find around Alpha Centauri a whole separate life that had a completely independent origin, then that would be more bad news about our future.
I find the expression looking at the wrong end of the telescope one that's worth remembering. It's funny that until recently, with all the discussion of looking out for conscious life in the universe, we don't talk about consciousness here on the Earth so much. And Elon Musk, at least not in the mainstream, Elon Musk has changed a lot of that with his portfolio of work, whether it's Tesla or SpaceX and also artificial intelligence with Neuralink. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on his portfolio of work and how it relates to what we've been discussing today.
Well, I'm in general, as many people are, a fan of Elon Musk in terms of just the raw ambition and range of the projects that he's tried. I want a world where there's just a lot more big, ambitious projects. That said, I'm not that excited about any one project. I just like to see a lot of big projects. So probably the most promising thing he's doing, as he probably well knows, is his Starlink attempt to create a lot of satellites that create a cheaper internet that competes with internet on the ground. It's not clear to me that there is, in fact, enough demand to pay for the cost of that. But at least, if he succeeds, that'll be a big win. I'm more skeptical about Mars as a revenue source anytime soon. That seems to be more a labor of love and hope and branding to make his vision, big. Obviously, Tesla is a big success so far. Whether it'll be a success into the future depends a lot on what happens when the other car companies also make batteries and electric cars. And it's less clear that Tesla can win there in the long run, but maybe they will. In terms of Neuralink, that's just a small project. If it fails, it's a very small amount of investment. I don't fault him at all for that. But people often present it as this hope whereby, the machines are coming and they'll take over all the jobs, that Neuralink will help save us. Why would Neuralink help save the machines? Well, we'll have this neural link to the machines. And you think and go, okay, well, see, each task is either going to be done by a human or a machine. And as the machines get better, they will naturally do more of the tasks. And in the long run, that's a substantial threat to the humans doing the task. And of course, again, in my book, Age of M, I lay out the scenario where the machines basically beat out the humans, although they're very human-like machines. But if you say instead, well, no, the machines won't beat out the humans because it'll be machine-human teams that win through this connection. And then you pause and you say, well, each part of the team will be doing something. And so what really Neuralink does is it creates higher bandwidth between particular machines and particular humans. And that allows those teams to work more closely together. But in general, you don't put people on teams unless they're productive enough to be, competitive, to be compatible with the other members of the team. So if machines are all just much better than humans, it doesn't make that much sense to make a team out of a human and a machine where you connect them together, but then the machine is just so much better. So I think it's misleading to think of Neuralink kind of technologies as a thing that will protect humans from losing their jobs if AI gets really capable. I mean, the main thing that will protect humans is that machines aren't that capable, and they're not going to be that capable for a long time because AI just isn't progressing nearly as fast as the media tends to project. But in the long run, certainly is an issue that the machines get good enough, then they take the jobs. And I don't think, again, a higher bandwidth connection between you and the machine really, saves you in the long run.
You've touched on many of our favorite topics here as we go through things, but before we wrap things up, I wanted to make sure that we got a chance to get some of your thoughts about blockchain technology, because there's really so much that we discussed earlier around governance and consensus. How we communicate and create value is really being debated around this technology. What are your views about blockchain, and especially in connection to what we've discussed so far?
I love living in a world where people are trying big ideas like blockchain and FinTech. And I love the fact that I don't have to pay for it if I'm not that excited about it. I like many of the ideas where they are interesting and abstract. But over the years, I've been sort of waiting to see traction with real customers and revenue. So most of the activity I see in this world is primarily building tools and forms, hoping that other people will fill in the detail of actual customers and revenue. And so The longer I see people sort of getting a lot of investment and spending it on writing white papers and doing abstract algorithms, and fewer people actually, connecting to customer revenue, the more skeptical I get about whether this thing is really going to last in the long run. Now, of course, eventually maybe they'll get traction and eventually they'll have lots of customers and that'll be great. But it seems like the main customer so far, besides say, buying illegal drugs or something like that, has been people willing to invest in, say, Bitcoin in order to have a place they can store value that might be able to hide from authorities, say tax authorities, and the place they could leave it in a crisis or a big disaster where it might sit there. And so that is an application. And if that sort of ends up being the main application, I guess the story is that Bitcoin would be the main source of value, and that would have been worth investing in. But that will be a relatively modest source of revenue for this whole industry. If they actually end up getting lots of traction with lots of other customers and revenue, then it'll probably be some other coin and some other infrastructure that is where most of that activity is. And then those will be the coins and the items that are high value, and Bitcoin probably won't be so high value. And so a lot of the investment in Bitcoin, and it's right up in some senses a bet that those other things will fail. And basically the main, customer revenue will be people who are just trying to hide their assets and secure their assets in a way that other people can't see. So I really would love to be wrong. And I would love for this area to get, concrete traction with customers. But one of the main things that people sell from this area is to say, well, we can do things here. And yes, they might be more expensive and they might be, more difficult, but we can evade regulations here. The story from the very beginning has been, while most of finance is very heavily regulated and limited, this area is not so heavily regulated and limited because we can put up a blockchain and have it running around the world and the regulators can't touch it. Now, for that to work, it would need to be that the people running these things and saying these companies and things like that really tried to keep anonymous. They didn't show up in person at meetings with their face uncovered, and they didn't have addresses where their companies are located and things like that. But apparently most of the players in this world are not anonymous. They are at particular locations. They show up in person. And so that seems to me like they have sort of left aside the option to really defy regulators. If regulators so far haven't, come down hard on them, it's because regulators have, decided to leave them a space, that they're not causing that much harm yet, and maybe there'll be good things. But if at some point the regulators decide that this is just bad and they don't like it, it seems like they have a lot of options to crush it. So that means they can't be selling it on the basis of the ability to evade regulations. It'll have to be on the ability to somehow go along with regulations and produce customer revenue.
Thank you for that sobering perspective. I have to say, sometimes here in Switzerland, there's a bit of a forgetfulness about the need to conserve the good of regulation as we drive forward innovation. I could go on about crypto, but I wanted to shift and ask a question about economics before we start to wrap things up. And that has to do with economic scarcity. We see it in developments around ESG, where there's carbon taxing and solutions for that. But I've heard a lot of people in innovation talk about the idea that scarcity could be disappearing. And I wondered what you thought about that.
The idea that scarcity is evaporating seems just crazy to me. I'm sorry. What may happen is that we get satiated in some domains and areas, and then we are less interested in more in those areas because we are focused on getting more in other areas. But we've always had areas where we are eager to get more, and I just can't see us ever not having areas of life and society where we are eager to get more. When we have enough food, when we have enough shelter, then we are competing for status and respect. We want attention, prestige. We want to impress people. And I just have not seen limits on how far we are willing to go to get more of those things. Basically, sometimes there are some people who are just completely satiated with everything in their life, but those are pretty rare people, and I don't really think the fraction of them has been increasing. And so I think scarcity is just a permanent feature of humanity, at least until we fundamentally change human nature sometime. And I think that's pretty unlikely too. I mean, we will probably fundamentally change human nature, but just not in the direction of eliminating scarcity.
I'm going to trust you on that one. I think history has proven it again and again that it's a pretty safe bet. Something we ask a lot of people, especially those who are dealing with complex subjects that can sometimes be a bit scary, like the future, is how do they find balance and inspiration in their life? And I was wondering if you could say a few words about that.
I mean, scary is just the flip side of interesting. If you are not interested in the interesting topics, you stay away from them and you focus on uninteresting, safe, boring topics. And then sometimes you feel bored and unexcited. And the interesting topics are the topics where there's a lot at stake, up and down. And I've always preferred to focus on the interesting topics, which I've known includes, some elements of scary, but that's part of them being big at stake. There's a lot at stake there. And that means they have huge upsides too. So I'm happy and eager to take the package of topics that have downsides and upsides and lots at stake. And I want to get in there and figure it out and try to understand it.
I think I know what you mean, and I tend to be drawn to a challenge myself. Over time, I've learned that it has its ups and its downs, and you really do have to be resilient and persistent when you're looking at the world.
If I was running a company or something, I would just be much more stressed in these areas. But as just a safe academic on the side who just comments on these things, my downside is pretty low. I have tenure, I have a secure community or relationship. I'm not actually personally risking that much by having comments on these things, but if I were actually in one of these scenarios where a lot was at stake for me, well, then I would be a lot more stressed and a lot more anxious about it.
Well, Robin, I think that would be the perfect time to ask you if you have any final messages for our audience at FinTech Plus.
Just in general, you're in a space where there's a lot of activity and a lot of excitement, but you should just keep your mind open and looking for other new areas that'll pop up that'll eventually be as big and exciting as this, that at the moment are just a glimmer in someone's eyes. So I'm always looking for the next thing. So I tell you, also keep an eye out for the next thing.
Thanks for that great plug, Mark. And we always like to talk about FinTech Plus because the idea is that once you combine those two, you can really go much further with the topic of finance and technology. But I want to really wrap up by saying it was a great pleasure to speak with you today, and thank you. We've enjoyed so much sharing the insights from your work.
Thank you so much for talking to me.